Could Indiana cornerback D'Angelo Pons be the next Brent Grimes in Atlanta?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network on the planet. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is giving you a way to turn that energy into an even bigger potential wins with a college basketball parlay profit boost. Head to FanDuel.com to get started. So if you don't know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are celebrating another mock draft Monday. We will be looking at PFF analyst Dalton Wasserman's 3-round mock draft from last week, where he had the Falcons taking a corner and wide receiver in rounds 2 and 3. Indiana cornerback D'Angelo Pons, Georgia wide receiver Zachariah Branch. We'll also be discussing the intel from ESPN's Jeremy Fowler and Dan Graziano that they dropped from the combine on Sunday morning that will allow us to get deeper into the Falcons quarterback plans and talking about the potential attraction to Tua Tagovailoa, as well as maybe Kaden Elliss pricing himself out of Atlanta. But let's start off with the mock draft from Dalton Wasserman from PFF, where he had the Falcons in round 2 taking D'Angelo Pons, the Indiana cornerback, and then in round 3 taking Georgia wide receiver Zachariah Branch. We talked about Branch on last week's mock draft Monday as a round 2 option. As I said then, I thought makes a little bit more sense in round 3. We'll talk about sort of Branch and if the, issues surrounding Branch change after the combine. But let's get into D'Angelo Pons, measuring in at 5'9", 182 pounds, had the best vertical jump at the combine among corners. That was the only athletic testing that he participated in. He did do on-field work, but that 43.5-inch vertical leap was top 5 among all players at the combine, #1 for the cornerback position. And it's giving, Brent Grimes a little bit when it comes to the vibes of an undersized corner like D'Angelo Pons, specializing in off-man coverage, off-zone coverage in college at Indiana. And we've been joking on this podcast for like the last 6 weeks about the Falcons' plethora of shrimp cornerbacks, right? Already in the building. Guys like Mike Hughes and D. Alford and Clark Phillips and Natron Brooks and Billy Bowman, and the need for the Falcons to get a little bit more size in that cornerback room opposite A.J. Terrell. And D'Angelo Pons is not really checking that box, but we've sort of joked about how the Falcons just have that regular old shrimp in their cornerback room, and we're looking for that gourmet shrimp. And I think Pons definitely qualifies as that, as opposed to some of the other, options that the Falcons currently have, in addition to several other sort of undersized corners that are expected to be, day 2 selections like Pons. And, Pons, I think most people project him to be more of that nickel inside cornerback because of some of the size concerns, but because of the potential athleticism that he displayed at the combine. And he'll be working out at his pro day with the rest of the Indiana guys. So very few of those guys actually worked out at the combine, likely due to, knowing that that's going to be a big day with Fernando Mendoza working out and more eyes being on those guys at the pro day. So no necessarily rush to get those testing done in Indy, and they can do that later this month or early next month, whenever that pro day is. But, rarely do you find a guy that jumps that high at that size and is not going to check the other athletic boxes, when we get to that pro day and he does his workout. So, Brent Grimes is kind of the sort of maybe high-end ceiling comp as we sit here in terms of the vibes based off of that size. I think Pons can fit in Atlanta as an outside corner. I think he'll major primarily as an inside guy. And certainly I do think you do wonder a little bit even if the Falcons do take a guy like Pons in round 2, are you still going to be on the lookout for an outside corner? And, we talked about this with Zachariah Branch being more of that wide receiver 3 versus a wide receiver 2 option. and sort of feeling better about a Branch draft pick on day 2 of the draft if the Falcons are able to solve that wide receiver 2 need in free agency. And it's kind of a similar thing with Pons, where it's like you would feel a lot better about Pons's potential upside as a nickel guy, where he didn't spend a lot of time in Indiana, but certainly projects to have the skill set to do that at the next level. If the Falcons address their CB2 need on in free agency. And so, I think Pons, when we look at Brent Grimes upside, another player comparison that I like, maybe a little bit more of that eye level comp, as we often do here on this podcast, in terms of not necessarily, is someone like Byron Murphy, who plays for the Vikings currently, used to play for the Cardinals. Also a sort of smaller corner, has that inside outside versatility. Been very effective and useful player on good defenses. You saw it with Vance Joseph's defenses in Arizona. You see it now with Brian Flores' defenses in Minnesota. You don't necessarily look at a player like Murphy as like, oh, that's the reason why that defense is good, as like a cornerstone piece, but he's a very useful player because of his inside outside versatility, your ability to use him in that nickel as well as on the outside, even if you wouldn't necessarily look at him as a shutdown outside corner. So that's kind of what I see Pons being like in the 3 years. Like we're sitting here imagining 3 years from now, the Falcons having a legit top 5 defense. You can see Pons being like the Byron Murphy there, where it's just like, yeah, he's not one of their like 5 best players on that defense, but he's like the 6th or 7th best guy. And he's so useful, so valuable, plays with toughness, plays with an edge despite his smaller status, which is, why we consider him to be a little bit more of that gourmet shrimp, where we don't want small guys that play small. We want small guys that are going to be willing to be physical. And I think Pons checked those boxes. So you see a lot of potential there. You look at the Falcons scheme. They like, as far as Pons projecting as an outside corner, the Falcons over the last 2 years, and we'll see if this changes now that Raheem Morris is out of the building, because I think this is certainly an element of Raheem Morris' scheme, where the Falcons would typically only put one of their corners in press coverage, typically AJ Terrell, and play the other guy off. And that, to me, that style of defense fits D'Angelo Pons a lot better than necessarily we're going to play a lot more press man. He can play press man. They do play that occasionally at Indiana, but it's not necessarily something that you think he's going to do at a high level, going up against some of the bigger wideouts that he'll see in the NFC South as well as throughout the NFL. But quickly on Zachariah Branch, before we move on, measured in at 5'9", 177 pounds, 4.35 official 40, did some jumps and whatnot. I'm seeing, Tavon Austin comps, Wan'Dale Robinson comps, Tank Dell comps, all those types of things. We talked about Branch being more of that gadget guy at this point based off his college film, and you got to project a lot with him. He'd had a good on-field workout. And so if you're optimistic about his projection to the next level, it was a question that we talked about last week on the Mock Draft Monday, which is like, it's a question of can't versus didn't. Right. When Branch, with a high level, like half of his targets, half of his catches were screen passes, which is not something that immediately translates to the next level, in terms of being that complete wide receiver and not just a gadget guy. We asked the question of can't versus didn't, right? Was he only a gadget guy because he can't do other things, or was he a gadget guy because he didn't ask to be do other things? And so I think based off of the on-field workout, you feel a lot better that that's more of a didn't question than a can't question. And so we'll see with Zachariah Branch, but Dalton having Branch in that 3rd round, to me, makes a lot more sense for what type of player that I think Branch is, as we discussed last week on the Mock Draft Monday. So we will leave that aside and look at, moving ahead to some combine intel, right? This is the time of year where people get little nuggets about what they're hearing from various coaches and teams and GMs and decision makers and agents that are all descending on Indianapolis throughout this week. And we got some nuggets across the league from ESPN insiders Jeremy Fowler and Dan Graziano on Sunday morning, including a couple on the Falcons involving their quarterback situation, where Joe Flacco seems to be the betting favorite, but at least one person in Indianapolis feels like Tua Tagovailoa is a legit option. And we'll talk extensively about why, if at all, the Falcons, if that's true, why the Falcons would be interested in Tua as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So it's March, and we know that college basketball is now nonstop. There's going to be big games, tight spreads, and momentum swings every single night. From early tip offs to late night West Coast shootouts, there's always going to be action on the board. And now FanDuel is giving you a way to turn that energy into bigger potential wins with a college basketball parlay profit boost. You can build any college hoops parlay you want, whether it's rivalry games, ranked matchups, whatever you like. And you can mix spreads, totals, and player props to match how you see the slate playing out. And then you can apply that profit boost and instantly bump up the potential payout. So go safe, go bold, ride the team that you've been following all season long, or just whoever has the current hot hand. It's your parlay, it's your style, just now with a little bit more upside to it. Head on over to FanDuel.com to get started and take advantage of this offer. That's FanDuel.com. FanDuel, play your game. Now, the pressure is high in the NFL, and so it is in your workplace, with deadlines overflowing inboxes and that one position sitting open that you have to fill. When the pressure is on, you need the right hire. Indeed is all you need. Indeed sponsored jobs are going to help you reach the right people who actually fit what you're looking for, so you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your post. Over the next minute that I am talking to you, companies like yours will have made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes, from the right skills, experience, and location, with Indeed sponsored jobs. Get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support the show by saying that you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed sponsored jobs. So we know that the offseason does not exist for the everydayer, and you can join the Falcons offseason discussion all year long by heading over to and joining the Everydayer Club, right? And you can get every episode ad-free as well. Hit that link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com to find out more. So, we got some nuggets from Jeremy Fowler and Dan Graziano, who throughout this calendar year published their sort of weekly intel report on ESPN. And obviously this is a big week with the combine stuff. Basically the two nuggets when it came to the Falcons quarterback situation, and we were hoping to get these nuggets as we discussed on the podcast several times over the last month. It was this time of year when the rest of the NFL was talking about Kirk Cousins. We here on this podcast, we're talking about Kirk a long time before that, coming to Atlanta back in 2024. This year, we don't necessarily have that type of insight. And so, these sort of nuggets coming out of the combine were going to be much more influential this year than 2 years ago. But, the smart money seems to be the nuggets were basically many people in Indianapolis are expecting Joe Flacco to follow Kevin Stefanski to Atlanta. We've been talking about how that's sort of the safe bet. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But the more interesting nugget was a coach apparently, went unsolicited to Jeremy Fowler and basically said, keep an eye out or watch out for Tua Tagovailoa to Atlanta. So we'll circle back to that Tua notion. But let's talk a little bit about the Flacco thing. We've been saying all along since the end of the season, since after the Super Bowl, Flacco seems like the safe bet. You have too many connections of people that are potential influential figures in this market that, go back a long ways with Joe Flacco. Obviously, Matt Ryan and Joe Flacco came into the league a long time ago. I wouldn't say they were best friends, but certainly longtime acquaintances. Ian Cunningham started his time in Baltimore back in 2008 as a low-level scout the year that they drafted Joe Flacco and went through that. Then in his final year, I believe in Philadelphia, they brought in Joe Flacco to be Jalen Hurts' backup there. They ultimately traded him to the Jets, where Jeff Ulbrich was the defensive coordinator there. And so he was back and forth in New York those next 2 seasons, then lands in Cleveland, where he joins Kevin Stefanski in 2023, helps guide that team to the playoffs, and then obviously bounced around the league for a little bit and then rejoins Kevin Stefanski this past all season. And, I got some feedback from some folks being like, oh, didn't the Browns move off of Joe Flacco this past year when they traded him to the Bengals? And that seems like something that was more of a Andrew Berry, the Browns GM front office thing, because the story I heard was like when they brought it up at the press conference to Kevin Stefanski, he was like caught off guard by it. And he was like, oh, I didn't realize we did that. Right. Like, so like he was operating like Joe Flacco was going to be my starting quarterback. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it seems like the safe bet that if you're going to bring somebody into the building, Joe Flacco makes a ton of sense given all the connection points that you have looking for that bridge quarterback option. But, we got some more intel suggesting, we've been talking about Joe Flacco being that bridge bucket, that bucket number 2 of the 3 buckets the Falcons are looking for, a starter, a bridge, or a backup. Joe Flacco seems to be the smart money for that bridge bucket alongside guys like Jacoby Brissett. But we've been talking the last week about, there's more rumors about the Falcons looking for that bucket number 1, a guy that if you sign this guy, the expectation is he's going to be the starter, and it's not guaranteed that Michael Penix is going to get the starting job back like it would be if, you were to sign someone like a Joe Flacco, who I think no one expects Joe Flacco to start, 17 games here in Atlanta. But if you were to sign someone like Tua Tagovailoa, who's in that first bucket, I think the expectation would be that he would start 17 games. Now, we kind of were like, Tua as a signing earlier this week when, we were talking about Jason Lockheim-Forward's report about the Falcons looking for that upgrade there in terms of a new starter. But, it does make sense a little bit more sense when you think about it, just because Tua is expected to be a post-June 1 cut by the Miami Dolphins. They're going to talk about trading him, but no one's going to take on that contract. And so based off of this intel report from Jeremy Fowler and others, Tua is almost certainly going to be a post-June 1 cut. And because of that, that would potentially allow the Falcons to land him. Kyler Murray is also in this potential boat, as well as some other guys like Geno Smith and others. Kirk Cousins is theoretically in this boat as well. These guys are going to get cut that are, their current teams are going to pay portions of their salary, and there's going to be offsets. And so those guys could be signed for a veteran minimum type of contract, which is going to be about $1.3 million this year. And it's similar to the situation that the Steelers found themselves in with Russell Wilson. When the Broncos cut Russell Wilson with a lot of dead money, basically he could play for a veteran minimum deal. And for those of you that were very much against paying Kirk Cousins all that money and wanted to go the cheap route with Russell Wilson, or some other veteran quarterback option in that 2024 cycle, this is kind of like a do-over for that, where we can do that again. Whether how you feel about Tua versus Russell Wilson versus all that stuff is certainly, certainly your mileage may vary on that. But like that's kind of the selling point, where it's just like we can sign a decent starter, a top 25 quarterback, again, depending on the offense, depending on the day. Tua could be anywhere from 12 to 25 when you're ranking the quarterbacks. But like you can get, a top 25, top 20 potential starter for $1.3 million. That's pretty good bang for your buck. If you're the Falcons, not to mention it doesn't impact your compensatory pick formula because Tua is going to be a cut player. And as we've discussed, and we'll probably go over this even further later this week, how the compensatory pick formula works. Cut players do not count towards that. And so as the Falcons navigate this offseason, we're probably going to see a number of players like Tyler Allgeier, Kaden Elliss. We'll talk about Kaden Elliss later in the episode, and as well as Allgeier, Leonard Floyd, David Onyemata, Arnold Bichetti. All these guys walk in free agency, and the Falcons could get day 3 comp picks back as part of Ian Cunningham's strategy to accumulate those draft assets in 2027 and beyond. And Tua's not going to impact that. So that's one selling point for Tua. Another selling point, and part of me wonders, this unknown coach that offered this unsolicited, is just sort of connecting the dots, where it's one of those things where it's like, does Kevin Stefanski secretly have a fascination for Tua Tagovailoa? Because I heard this last year with the rumors are that the Browns took Dylan Gabriel, who like Tua is, left-handed Hawaiian quarterback, more of that sort of precise pick your defense apart on the short and intermediate game without the sort of big time arm. A big reason why the Browns were attracted to Gabriel and took him as early as they did is because that was a Kevin Stefanski pick, right? That was throwing Kevin Stefanski a bone. It's one of the reasons why when Kevin Stefanski was calling plays, they stuck with Dylan Gabriel, and once they made the switch to Tommy Rees, they switched to Shedeur Sanders. But there was a rumor or suggestion last year, Greg Cosell, I know of NFL Films, was one of the people that put is basically like what Kevin Stefanski sees in Dylan Gabriel is Tua Tagovailoa, which is timing, rhythm quarterback that can attack the middle of the field, that can operate Kevin Stefanski's scheme very effectively. And you do wonder in this hypothetical scenario, that's why they might be more attracted to a guy like Zachariah Branch, who's more that gadget guy, because you go to Miami and Miami ran a ton of screens, like more screens, and Tua's thrown more screens than any quarterback the last couple of years, right? As the Browns didn't really do that a whole lot. In under Kevin Stefanski, and you do wonder if they did more of that last year than they had previous years. But like, you do wonder, like, okay, that's where Zachariah Branch makes sense as a gadget guy, because if they bring in Tua, they're probably going to run a lot of screens, all that sort of stuff. But that will be a conversation for a later day. But you do wonder if like Kevin Stefanski secretly has this like affinity for Tua. And that's why he wanted Dylan Gabriel in Cleveland, and now he gets an opportunity to get Tua in Atlanta. That will be certainly, I think, something worthy of discussion as we go through this process. But, the knock on Tua is, limited upside. You got to put him in the right system. You got to put him in the right circumstances. That remains to be seen if Atlanta and, Kevin Stefanski will do as good a job as Miami did with, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and A-Chain and Mike McDaniel in Miami the last couple of years when Tua was at his best. But, the other knock on Tua is the injury history, right? Obviously has a very scary history with concussions, and it's like the idea of like the next concussion could retire him. And then you couple that with other nagging injuries that he's had throughout his time in Miami, going back to his collegiate days. So, we've talked before about not just adding one quarterback, but the Falcons adding two or more quarterbacks this offseason. Again, with Michael Penix as the only quarterback currently on the roster, with Kirk and Easton Stick gone, Emory Jones gone. The expectation is the Falcons are going to bring 4 quarterbacks to camp. Penix is going to be one of those. But, they're going to probably proceed this offseason with the idea of like, we're going to get these 3 other quarterbacks, and those potentially could be our 3 quarterbacks heading into the season, depending on, when Penix's recovery timetable is. And so if Tua is one of those quarterbacks, it does maybe prioritize a little bit more who that QB3 is going to be, because in a world where you're handing the starting spot off to Tua and Penix, comes back whenever he comes back, but there may be a gap between, if Tua gets injured and Penix's return, and you need to have another option. And so, that to me is where like a Kenny Pickett or somebody like that may come into the fold, or somebody like that. So we'll see on that front, but I'm sure we'll continue discussing these quarterback options. But, another person out there sort of suggesting, maybe the Falcons are interested in Tua and whatnot. And I know Tua is not going to be anybody's first option, but, who knows, as we've discussed before, like, are the Falcons going to get their first option in this quarterback cycle? Are they going to have to settle for their second or third option? And I think that's a realistic world where Tua could be, ultimately that selection, or Flacco or whatever. So we'll see on that front, but I'm sure we'll hear more information in the week to come. Since we're 1 week away from the tampering period beginning and free agency sort of kicking off. So lots more discussion there, but we'll talk a little bit more about Kaden Elliss in his contract, as well as Tyler Allgeier a little bit, 2 other nuggets from that intel piece from Fowler and Graziano as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So we live in a world where you can stream anything, order foods in minutes, and carry supercomputers in our pockets, and somehow buying tickets to a live game still feels complicated. You got hidden fees, jumping prices, endless steps. There's got to be a better way, and there is. That's why I use the GameTime app. It gives the advantage back to the fans and makes getting tickets simple, whether it's NFL games, concert, comedy, music, theater, whatever you're into. I've been eyeing the GameTime app to look at some tickets for this upcoming friendly at the end of the month between USA and Portugal. And it's just so easy to navigate. I can preview my seats before I buy them. All the price you see is the price you pay, because it includes all the fees, no hidden surprises at checkout. And of course, GameTime is offering zone deals where you kind of pick your section, and then GameTime is going to pick the seats for extra savings. So just 2 taps and you can have great seats locked in. It's fast, it's easy, and now it's done. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets, download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download GameTime today. So wrapping up today's episode with other free agent intel, a big piece of nugget was that Kaden Elliss is expected to be one of the top 3 highest paid off-ball linebackers in this free agent cycle. They also mentioned that Tyler Allgeier is a player that the Falcons want back, but is expected to test the market. And as we discussed before, if Allgeier makes it to the market, I don't expect him back in Atlanta. There's really no upside for a Tyler Allgeier to return to Atlanta. Unless like his market is really depreciated, and we do not expect that to be the case. But let's talk a little bit more about Kaden Elliss and what is a realistic price tag for Kaden Elliss given this new information. Now, I've seen PFF project Kaden Elliss to sign a 3-year, $36 million deal, $12 million per year. The Athletic have it at 2 years, $19 million, so about $9.5 million per year. We've discussed it kind of like, okay, well, the Falcons want to get Kaden on like $8 million a year. He might get $12 million a year on the open market. Maybe they can compromise, split the difference at $10 million a year or something like that. But like, I imagine with this top 3 intel, we're talking 12 million plus easily, right? Where the likelihood of the Falcons getting him at 10 million or lower is almost virtually zero, right? And we give credence to this with Jeremy Fowler because he was on the Drew Dahlman is going to be a hot commodity on the open market like since late January of last year, like 6 weeks before free agency. And his general track record with Falcons intel has been right. He was one of a handful of people that in the week before the 2024 draft was like, hey, keep an eye on this Penix thing, right? And we were at the time, we were like, doesn't make any sense. We were wrong on that. And we also were like, oh, I don't know about the Dahlman stuff. And then we were right. So at this point in time, Jeremy Fowler has definitely earned the benefit of the doubt when it comes to this. But, looking at PFF's like top 3 linebacker free agents in their projections, Devin Lloyd is at $16 million. Devin Bush is at $12 million. And Nakobe Dean is at nearly $14 million per year. The Athletic has the same 3 guys, Lloyd at $19 million, Bush at nearly $16 million a year, and Dean at nearly at about $10 million a year. So that's what we're talking about, top 3 money. That's why I say like $12 million feels like very likely for if he's going to get top 3 money. You look at some of the big money contracts given out to outside free agents the last couple of off seasons. Tremaine Edmunds was $18 million. Patrick Queen was almost $14 million 2 years ago. Azeez Al-Shaair was over 11. Robert Spillane was $11 million last year. Dre Greenlaw was $10.5 million last year. So it's very likely that price tag is going to go up with the increase of the salary cap. We saw last year the top free agents that did not leave their respective teams, but Zach Bond, Nick Bolton, and Jamie and Sherwood each got $15 to $17 million a year on those contracts, never made it to market. So it does sound like if the expectation is Kaden Elliss is going to be behind guys like Devin Lloyd and Devin Bush and ahead of potentially Nakobe Dean as a top 3 off-ball linebacker this offseason, that he's going to get $12 million a year. And I feel like that's going to price him out of Atlanta at this point in time. And, if Kaden Elliss can get that money, good on him. As you guys well know, if you're an everyday of this podcast, we've long been big supporters of Kaden Elliss here on this podcast. And, let that man cash in. We got no shade in that. It's just going to be one of those things where at his age, at his price tag, it's understandable why the Falcons will be like, we can get younger, especially as we've discussed over the last couple of days. This is one of the deepest, one of the best and strongest linebacker classes that we've seen in a decade, according to some people in the draft. And so it makes all those sense in the world that we already knew the Falcons were going to invest in their depth. And if they have to instead, rather than just getting a backup, they go after and target a starter, as well as plenty of options like Patrick Queen. I think I saw something either today, whether it was the Fowler report or somebody else, that Patrick Queen's going to be on the trade market. Tremaine Edmunds, we've already talked about him being a cap cut and whatnot. So there should be veteran options as well. And some of those I'm sure we'll discuss as the week unfolds, as we get you guys geared up for free agency. But that's going to do it for us here on today's episode. Another thing that occurred over the weekend is we got the official salary cap number at $301.2 million. And one of our next episodes will be sort of going over that, how that impacts the Falcons salary cap situation and their potential spending this offseason in free agency and sort of ways that the Falcons can create more cap space. So that will be, potentially next on your docket. We'll also potentially do a combine recap, a full breakdown, looking at some of these standout wide receivers and offensive linemen in these last 2 days of the combine. Maybe even talk a little bit about some of the running backs and whatnot that could be potential Tyler Allgeier replacements. So that's in store for you as well, probably in your Locked On Falcons feed. So check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL, Locked On NFL Draft, Locked On NFL Scouting for the full combine recap and the standouts and all the buzz going on elsewhere in the NFL for the other 31 NFL teams. And of course, if you never miss an episode, the Everyday Club is for you. Get Locked On Falcons ad-free, plus members-only Discord access and so much more. Head to the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com to find out more. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.